Ooh, what a mess. Hello. In this video you will finally get to see the finished inlay on the fretboard as I will sand this all down. But first, I still haven't glued the logo into the headstock. Now, with my experience of the fretboard and using fine sawdust, ebony sawdust to stain the epoxy, I think that's how I'm going to do this, but with 2 lots of epoxy. This should be fun. I hope it works. So let's get to work on the headstock. I should probably explain what this masking tape is doing. The masking tape is showing me where a crack in, or a break in the abalone is, just here. And when I put epoxy in the cavity, I am going to avoid this small area here, so that hopefully when I press the 2 halves in, I don't get epoxy in the joint. I can then use super thin super glue to effectively join the 2 halves together. It'll wick into the gap, but more importantly it will seal the gap, so that when I do fill epoxy both sides, I'm not going to get any epoxy in the join. If I didn't do it that way and I just put epoxy all through the cavity and then just press these pieces in, chances are I'm going to get a little bit of epoxy between the 2 halves of the joint, and that will be visible. Perhaps another way of doing this is to join that with super glue before I put the 2 parts in the cavity, but the chances of me getting this joint so perfectly aligned that everything just slots precisely back in the cavity without breaking, I think are virtually 0. So I'm going to do it this way, keeping the joint as dry as I can, and hopefully when I flood it, well, not flood it, when I put a tiny amount of super thin super glue, wick it into the gap, it's not going to fill the cavities either side, so I can still fill with epoxy. That's the plan. Here's a piece of laburnum I use. This is 120 grit paper. I might switch to the 80 grit on the other side. I'm just going to create a little pile of light coloured dust and a pile of dark coloured dust. Just be aware that using this method to create sawdust, you are in danger of getting some grit in amongst the sawdust, which might glitter, particularly if it's cheap paper. But I think this, well, we'll see. Ultimately, I don't think it matters that much, not for this application. And there are probably mechanical methods of doing this which would be a lot quicker. Whoa, this is dark. The headstock will darken under finish anyway, so hopefully this will all match up when the headstock's finally finished. It does actually look rather nice. Not getting enough super glue on the end of the... Just breathing on the super glue, which helps dry it, because I don't want to spray accelerator onto this. This is... Oh, I've just spread the super glue, but I don't think that matters. Right, now to go over this with the epoxy, which is getting stiff already. This was 5 minute epoxy, and it was true to its word. It's unusual. It's unusable now, and this is, I guess, 10 minutes after I mixed it. Given how quickly this sets, I'm going to leave that for 10 minutes before doing the brown parts, and that way we don't risk mingling the two. I'm trying to make sure it's forced down into the crack, if I can. That way, when I sand back, I won't get any sudden gaps appearing. Hopefully. I don't know whether I'm just being too picky here. I don't know whether this is strictly necessary, but just by prodding and tamping, hopefully it works it into the crack. It's quite a thick paste. It's not something I think that's going to wick in, so that is overkill. But we should be alright. Ooh, what a mess. I'm going to use my partially covered levelling beam, 80 grit, 120 grit, to take this down, just to avoid touching the rest of the headstock until I absolutely have to. And to further that aim, I've covered up the remainder of the headstock with masking tape. So let's see how this goes. Most of what I'm taking off now is abalone shell, so I've got to be a bit careful with dust. I'm applying the dust extractor regularly. I'm now going to switch to 120 grit. This is not new paper, but it should be alright. And at some point I might just switch to just a normal sanding block. Well, let's see how it goes. The paper blocks up very quickly at this stage. There's just this slight haze now, so I'm going to switch to normal 120 grit on a block, and then 240 grit, and probably leave it at that. But we're at the finishing off stage now, because we've just got to get rid of that slight haze around the R. And I'll take all this grubby masking tape off. And in case you're wondering, I'm protecting my index finger because whenever I'm using sandpaper like this, I always take my fingerprint off and then can't use my iPhone fingerprint recognition. And now 240 grit. Before I sand the fretboard, I'm just going to fill in the little holes on the back using super glue, and I'm going to leave it for quite a while. I've regretted in the past using super glue as a filler, thinking that it was going to be an instant fix when it wasn't. When you've got a volume of super glue, it takes quite a while to set because super glue catalyzes with moisture usually, I think. And so if you've got a large cavity, if you've used it as a filler with some sawdust, sometimes the inner parts take a while to dry. I'm not saying this will take that long, but I'm going to do it now and get it out of the way so that it's got plenty of time to dry. Don't know where that's really soaking into the hole. These are very large blobs of super glue. I should have had a pin handy just to poke into the hole. I suspect there's an air bubble. Get a cocktail stick out. Of course the danger is I'm going to get cocktail sticks stuck. But we'll see. Just see if we can poke it in and just work the super glue in. As you can see, there's no signs of the super glue setting just yet. We think of super glue as instant, but really it isn't. It needs a catalyzer. I don't know whether catalyzer is the right word, but it's usually moisture. You can make super glue dry by breathing on it, or you can use an accelerator, which is usually naphtha, I believe. The danger with using accelerator is it makes the super glue boil, I think, effectively. It goes white. Now that doesn't really matter here. Yeah, that should be filled. I think I probably will spray that with accelerator. I'm going to leave this for a while now. Make sure the super glue is absolutely dry before sanding it flat. .80 grit. And 20 grit. .240 grit. I will be going over this with a levelling beam, but I'm going to wait until I've glued it onto the neck because that may affect it. This is not strictly necessary at this stage, so I just thought I'd get it prettied up as much as I can. And you probably can't hear what I'm saying. I thought I'd just get it prettied up a little bit just to make sure that the inlay is exactly as I want it.